Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Josh Schrei. Josh is a writer, teacher, and a lifelong student of the cosmologies and mythologies of the world, in particular those of the Indian subcontinent. Throughout a lifetime of teaching, study, meditation, yogic practice, wilderness immersion, art, music, and public speaking, Josh has sought to navigate the living, animate spaces of the imagination and advocate for a world that prioritizes imaginative vision. Josh has lectured on art, aesthetics, and mythology at museums and contemporary arts centers around the world. He is the founder of The Emerald podcast, featuring interviews with award-winning authors and luminaries. The Emerald explores the human experience through a vibrant lens of myth, story, and imagination, drawing from a deep well of poetry, lore, and mythos to challenge conventional narratives on politics, meditation, mindfulness, art, science, literature, and more. The Emerald is indeed an amazing podcast, and what makes it unique is the incredible soundscapes that Josh creates, having been formerly a music producer. He's a bit of a wizard in the studio, and The Emerald is not like other podcasts in the sense that there is discourse, but there's also poetry and contemplative reflections woven in with music and sound effects to create really magical soundscapes. I'm glad to say that Josh is a friend of mine, and in this conversation, we do something a bit different from previous episodes because we interview each other. First, Josh is interviewing me about the role of guardianship and protector deities in Tantra, and beginning with the fascinating inquiry, what role does protection and guardianship have in a non-dual system? And we discover in this conversation that Tantra, as originally practiced, and animistic traditions have much in common. And then I go on to interview Josh a bit and ask about his journey and his most impactful and formative experiences. So I call this a double barrel conversation because we each interview each other. And I wish it had gone longer, but we do plan to speak again. And now I bring you Josh Schrei.
So I guess like going right to the heart of what I want to discuss today, and then I'm interested to see how it branches off. Guardianship and protection. So a defining characteristic of many ritual systems, including, as I have seen, tantric ritual, is an emphasis on guardianship and protection, an emphasis on invoking protector deities. Look at any mandala structure, and there's generally guardians at the gates and this type of thing. And, I think at certain times in tantric history, tantrikas were also called upon quite often to like maybe rid spaces of malevolent spirits and this type of thing. And I'm I'm interested in this kind of beautiful friction and tension between the understanding that ultimately everything is non-dual, um, and if everything is non-dual, what would you actually need guardianship and protection from? Um, in, I guess, in like the relative sense, like, you know, is there such a thing as something that we would need protection from, and what would that be? And yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Great. This is a big topic. This is a super important topic. And the question itself, the way you framed it, I know that you're echoing a framing you've heard from others rather than really your own. And that framing of the question simply betrays a profound misunderstanding or lack of understanding of non-duality, where it's almost as if Westerners conflate non-duality with monotheism. Like there's only one God, not a bunch of other gods we need to deal with. Um, and in non-duality, it's simply, I mean, there's many ways we can talk about non-duality, of course, but it's simply a teaching on the seamless unity of being, the indivisibility of anything from anything else, the fact that all boundaries are mind created. So any energy that's in one part of the universe can later be in another part of the universe. Everything is permeable, everything is fluid, everything is interconnected, interdependent, and there's no hard division to be found anywhere. That's one way we could summarize non-duality. And in this non-dual reality, there are other humans. Now, if you have a deep non-dual realization, you see another human, and they're not other. In fact, their body and mind is made of the same substance as your body and mind, and the consciousness looking through that body mind is one and the same as your consciousness, right? But still, humans behave in all sorts of unpredictable ways, and sometimes we want to protect ourselves from other human body entities, human body minds. um, and similarly then, you want to negotiate with, be aware of, protect yourself from non-corporeal beings, non-human entities. It's not quite right to say they're non-corporeal because they do have bodies. They're just bodies that aren't made of matter. They're made of various frequencies of energy, one might say. And so what's interesting is that we don't find any version of the tantric tradition that doesn't absolutely assume these beings are real. And in that sense, I think it's very similar to animist traditions. We could say that Tantra in its roots is animist, and that there are non-corporeal beings everywhere, absolutely everywhere, all the time, in every space, every kind of being. And there tend to be more in certain places, like those non-corporeal beings that don't like humans much, and there's a lot of those. They congregate in desolate places, where there aren't many humans, and so on. Now, the question of whether we need to protect ourselves from them, it to answer that, I have to bring in what I call the bell curve of conscious experience. The fact that in a universe where consciousness is everything and everything is consciousness, uh, anything can happen theoretically. Any experience is possible. But there's this bell curve, which means that the majority of humans are having similar sorts of experiences. They're in the middle of the bell curve. And then there's outliers that are having very different sorts of experience. And in my bell curve model, it's like one tail end of the curve is people having extremely atypical experiences that they experience as more negative, and other people on the other end of the bell curve are having extremely atypical experiences that they experience as positive. And of course, it could be the case that the two ends somehow meet for some people, right? But it is a bell curve, and so therefore, a lot of people do not experience non-corporeal beings, or at least they don't know that they do. And the tantric tradition would say, and there's many gurus and lamas that echo what I'm about to say, that if you're not experiencing non-corporeal beings, you probably don't need to worry about them much. But maybe you are experiencing them more than you realize because they influence what's going on in your environment and in your dreams and in your body and so on. So here's what I would say. There's a couple levels of protection or negotiating with these unseen forces. And it's great to talk about this, by the way, because it's not a topic I usually get into. So for people who experience non-corporeal beings in an obvious way, or even occasionally, but still in an obvious way, then they need to be very conscious of that, because of the fact that it's always a two-way street. Perception is a two-way street, meaning if you can see them, they can probably see you. If you can feel them, they can probably feel you. And so you need to negotiate with them. And why do you need to negotiate? Because from a traditional point of view, humans don't own land. They don't own anything. Ownership is a mental construct created by humans, right? The spirits of the land own the land because they are the land. They're inseparable from the land. And so we are always, temporary tenants, as it were, in their land. So that's why we need to negotiate with them. And there's another reason that the practitioner might be concerned about this, especially if you're doing tantric practice or shamanic practice, any powerful practice. If the practice is working, it's going to generate Shakti. It's going to generate more energy, more power. And the more power you generate, non-corporeal beings are drawn to feed off that power, like animals in a dry region come together to drink from the pool, one of the few pools that are around. And so these non-corporeal beings are not necessarily malevolent. Sometimes they are. It's just like humans. Some want to help you, some want to mess with you, and most don't care about you. But they're drawn to the power, even if they're not malevolent, and want to feed off it. Now, again, if you don't experience these beings, then probably no big deal. Although some people like to do clearing rituals just in case, because they don't feel any non-corporeal beings around, but I've been doing this supposedly empowering tantric practice for months and I'm not feeling the power. Could it be draining away because I don't have a strong enough container with enough protection? That's absolutely a possibility. But for those who do feel these beings in a visceral way, then they definitely need to do protection rituals to keep themselves safe, in the same way that somebody who's living in a place with a lot of dangerous humans is going to take measures to keep themselves safe and lock their door at night and stuff like that. So there's that whole dimension. But even for the people who don't experience non-corporeal beings, from a tantric point of view, which again is in this domain is very animist, you would want to pay attention if something weird happens, if something weird goes wrong in your household, in your body, in your world. And then you would want to listen. You would want to listen carefully. You'd want to explore that environment and listen carefully and see if you can find anywhere that where you feel something odd, and there it's just might be a subtle little feeling. There you would make an offering to a non-corporeal being or entity or spirit, whatever you want to call it, and offer your love, your compassion, your even make actual food offerings, as we still see in some cultures, like in Bali. And this can actually make a difference if that's the source of the issue. So again, it's not something to get obsessed with, and people can sort of distract themselves from their spiritual practice by getting too worried about this. Just like you can impede, your well-being by worrying too much about potentially dangerous humans are out there somewhere around, um, so yeah, non-duality, yes, but there are a diversity of beings, a diversity of expression of the one being, and we have to negotiate with that reality.
Mm.
And so, what level you negotiate on, like I said, depends on what your experience is. And if you're just doing the most simple protection rituals and space clearing rituals in Tantra, we're talking about something that takes you 3, 4, 5 minutes. It's not like a whole big deal. So I can describe those if you want, but that's my sort of overview of the topic.
Yeah, that's awesome. Exactly what I wanted to get to, and yeah, maybe in a minute we can go into some of the specifics. But I just want to echo a few things that you said because I think they're super important. And the first of which being the kind of confusion of non-duality to a kind of absolute monism, in which there's in which the absolute is real but the relative isn't, right? And that in and of itself creates a duality. And so the understanding that the navigation of the relative, you could say the navigation of Shakti in all the various ways that she, um, all of her combinatorials and all of her energetic distinctions is vitally important. And the reason I'm so interested in this topic is for a couple different reasons, really. And one of which is I've seen, and it kind of, I started seeing it a lot during the kind of rise of Anusara yoga and the kind of it's all Shri, it's all good, maybe vision of Tantra. Like, oh, it's all Shiva, it's all good, which, of course, for anyone with any understanding of the tradition, doesn't take away from the need to like conduct oneself in a certain way or like, you know, um, and so there's that.
And it's also just wrong, by the way. It's just to jump in to mention, it's just wrong because it's all Shiva doesn't mean it's all good. That Anusara and John Friend had a profound misunderstanding, which I tried to explain to him at the time, but I was myself a bit too green to effectively get my point across many years ago. But yeah, Shiva means blessing. The word Shiva means blessing, as well as the name of transpersonal consciousness, right? But when the tradition says it's all Shiva, that doesn't mean at all it's all good. But it does mean anything can be for a blessing. But that's a very different statement from saying it's all good. Like there's
Yeah,
very,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. And that the navigation of what you could call kind of relative forces and immediate forces is a big part of the practice. And then along with that, I just see in, what you could call kind of the neo spiritual circus out there, I see a lot of what I would call like unguarded activity. And, you and I talked when you were here about like um, Burning Man and like how that would be a ripe environment for something like spirit possession, for example. And this is something that I'm interested in getting into a little bit more. So, that bell curve model that you're talking about, I think is interesting to dive into. And also just like, there's a lot of people who want to take certain tenets of animism to be true, or certain tenets of Tantra to be true, but they don't want to necessarily look at, like, oh, there are things that I might do in my life that might leave me open to a whole lot of influences that I don't want to necessarily expose myself to. And I think that type of discernment around this is super important. So I'd be interested, yeah, to talk about both, like, what are some of the practices that you've seen of clearing and protection, but also, like, possessing entities, and the, like, all across the Indian subcontinent, everyone understands that possession is a reality. They understand this to be a reality. So, you know, what are these forces that might possess, and how does one, what does guarded space look like? And, you know, yeah,
Yeah.
how do you see these things?
Yeah, good question. Because again, people have in the West this artificial idea of our existence, that we're like monads, that a human is like a monadic unit, an entity with it that is, of course, a little bit permeable, like, oh, the air can get in our skin or whatever, but not really. And this is a kind of physicalist view, that pre-modern traditions in general, and certainly Tantra, don't hold this view. And indeed, in Tantra, it's like I said, everything is fluid. Reality is profoundly fluid and profoundly permeable. So there's no dividing line, and so there's influence and there's possession, but possession happens quite easily, um, on many different scales. So, for example, like there's the notion that if you're not careful, a wind spirit could get in your body and make you sick, but it doesn't even want to be there. It just accidentally went in one of your channels, and you don't know how to breathe it out, so it's just bouncing around in there, causing some problems or whatever. And of course, for things like illness, we can say, oh, well, we have better explanations now of how people get sick. But the actions that were enjoined traditionally were very reasonable actions, like, oh, this C7 vertebra at the base of the back of your neck, that's a place where wind spirits get in really easily. So cover that and keep it warm. And lo and behold, that actually does work to help you not get a cold. Um, and people, might say, yeah, but for these reasons, not for this wind spirit reason. And the tradition would say, what's the difference? These are just stories that we tell to try to account for our experience. And the fact is that the story that the world is full of animate forces is a very functional story, that it helps you negotiate life better. And it also opens you to a sense of wonder and vibrancy that you don't have when you see the world as just mostly dead. Mostly
Yeah,
everybody.
and relational responsibility, which I think is a huge part of it too.
Yes, because your actions are influencing the beings around you, and they are influencing you. There's this interdependence, and like if there was some, this is pretty rare for most people, but if there was some malevolent entity that was trying to attack you, that's not random. Like there's a karmic history, there's a karmic matrix that's unfolding, and it's not to say it's your fault either, but it's not random. So, what is possession? Avesha, the word for possession in Sanskrit, is absolutely central to the tantric traditions. And they have a nuanced understanding of this. There's this range of possibilities, from a subtle influence to a dramatic influence to sharing your body with another being, um, and ultimately the worst case scenario is that other being gaining the upper hand, as it were, gaining a lot of control. Not like in the movies where the person is just gone and the other being is controlling the body and there's no vestige of the person. That almost never happens according to this tradition, but very commonly the person is sharing space with this other being that might have more power, charisma, or influence, and can tend to dominate affairs. So possession is maybe not the right word. Maybe sharing space, sharing bodily space, is truer. Um, and we mentioned Burning Man, and I see possessed people there all the time. When I went to Burning Man for many years, and I just remember an incident where I was going into this one tent, big venue. I forget what it was. It was one of those on the margins of the Burning Man, Black Rock City, and there were these people with sage, right? And this sage, they were huge bundles of sage, and they were waving these huge bundles of sage up and down at the entrance to this big tent. And I went in there, and I'm like, this is not working at all. The place has plenty of possessed people, So the state of possession is one in which you are not fully conscious. It's like being in a trance, and you're not aware of the influence that's being exerted, and you might, if you attain sobriety later, a freedom from possession, you're going to look back and be like, what the fuck was that? Like, that was really weird. And you won't really be able to explain it if you don't have these models. um, but when people think they can wave a little sage around and that's it, but they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to invoke elemental powers. They don't know how to invoke protector spirits, guardians of the directions, things like this. And so it doesn't work. And Burning Man happens to be a perfect place for possession because it's in a desolate, remote location where humans are usually not there most of the year. And there's extreme stimulation of the senses, and there's psychedelic drugs, and there's sexuality, and all of that is like the perfect
It's a
recipe because
feast. It's an
it's a,
absolute
yeah,
feast.
a gigantic banquet for the spirits every year. Because sex and drugs opens up the energy body, activates the energy body, opens the orifices, both literally and energetically. And so, anything can happen, basically.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also not something to freak out about that much because, again, people have seen these horror movies or whatever and just got really confused about this sort of topic if they think about it at all. Because you can clear your space. You can, sometimes you need professional assistance, but you can negotiate new boundaries, right? Even though boundaries are ultimately mental constructs, they also have power, because when we say no to someone, that's what we mean by a boundary, right? It's not a literal thing. It's a standing firm in your energy and your power and saying no to something, which, by the way, is how I banished a possessing spirit many, many years ago when I was young. And this super intense, super palpable, obvious entity entered my room, and I was paralyzed. My body was physically paralyzed, and I ended up just screaming mentally, no, so loud. And then, it was gone. Luckily, I didn't have that many tools then, but a teacher later told me, a very awake spiritual teacher said, if you have Kundalini awakening, then you will likely be visited by an entity within 6 to 12 months. after that awakening. That happens all the time. People don't talk about it because they think, oh, they'll think I'm crazy. But that's what happened in my case. This was within 6 to 12 months after my initial awakening experience. So, should I go on to talk about how we do protection, or?
Well, yeah, let me insert a question in the midst of that that might lead
Yeah.
us to the how, because there's some interesting things you're talking there about the openness and porosity of the sense faculties specifically. And this is something that you see in a lot of animist tradition, but a lot of protection often involves the sensory gates. Like there's often some type of helper spirit installed in the region of the various sense organs, and then you see this in tantra too. In the I believe they're called, is it nyasa practices?
Mm-hmm.
The nyasa practices where like the syllables or the deities will be installed, or the armor of Durga will be installed. And specifically, I'm interested in talking about the relationship between, why do we need to guard the senses? And there are some obvious reasons. And then how does that type of guardianship work?
Yeah, the
And I'm
senses are
asking
good.
this, sorry,
Yeah.
um, I'm looking around at a world whose, let's say, mass behaviors are being deeply modified by things that people are taking in through their eyes, for example. And I don't think we always look at this through the perspective of, wow, something is passing through the sensory gate of my eyes and it's affecting my behavior and changing my behavior. And you see, people being radicalized. You see like all of these, extreme social movements. A lot of it is coming from simply like things that are being beamed through people's eyes and that they're being exposed to. So I feel like it's an important topic. Like, what you said around no, it's so important, right? Like when to say no and what to say no to is a huge part of like the spiritual process. And there's a tendency sometimes to have this like I want to be open to everything view, right? Oh yes, I want my heart to be more open. I want everything to be more open. And sometimes, like when it comes to the sensory gates, we need to limit what we take in, perhaps. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
That's hugely important. Let me just pause. Yeah, this is hugely important. And, the Surgeon General in the US has this idea now. We should put health warning labels on social media apps like on cigarettes and alcohol, health warning labels for minors. I think that's absolutely right. He's on the right track. It's going to be hard to actually do that, but what you take in through the sense gates modifies your embodied conscious experience, even if you're a practitioner who can transcend into absolute non-individual consciousness. There's the way conscious energy moves through embodied form, and that is modified by environment. It is modified by stimuli. So the experience you're having as an embodied consciousness is going to be influenceable always, even if you have that capacity to go vast into the experience of the absolute. So we move. It's like a spanda in the terminology of the tradition, that we move from this huge absolute scope or God's eye perspective into a very embodied perspective, and that movement is very natural for a practitioner. Um, and in the embodied sort of level of our being, we have to take care. We can't do the spiritual bypassing thing of like, oh, I realized that I am the absolute, so nothing matters. We have to take care. So here's the thing about taking in through the sense gates. What you said is actually quite brilliant. I do think teenagers are getting possessed through social media. They're getting possessed not by entities usually, but by, for example, obsessive concern with image. that becomes like a possessing spirit that can even drive the teenager to suicide and certainly to self-harm. And those rates have gone up 200-300%, in America, especially for girls. So wow, what a huge impact. And similarly, the boys, like the teenage boys, are more likely to find themselves somewhere like 4chan or 8chan and get radicalized by a possessing ideology like fascism or whatever. But yeah, they're vulnerable, they're open, and they're seeing something that at first strikes them as empowering, and they feel a sense of community with these other men. They don't have a strong male role model, maybe, and before you know it, they're a card-carrying member of a fascist group, and they don't have any defenses in that. So possessing entities can take the form of mental viruses or ideologies, and that's very real. And the possession is no less powerful than if we're talking about what seems to be an entity with its own agency. I mean, in a sense, ideologies do have a kind of agency. They propagate themselves through populations, as Dawkins wrote about with the concept of the meme, which is now, of course, misunderstood as just a funny picture with a caption. But a meme is any idea that is so powerful that it propagates itself through a population like a mental virus, So I want to come to one important point you made, though. If we're worried about all this, worried about what can affect us coming in through our sense gates, are we going to end up closed down, shut down, contracted, fearful, when the tantric ideal for sure is to be open and connected, right? So that openness, I would say, is our default state. It's absolutely our default state. And we must be open and connected to everything because we already are. So that's just being intimate with reality, right? And not trying to hide from reality. But you can cultivate this openness in your energy body, in your physical body, in your heart space, and walking down the street. And if you hear a gunshot, you're still going to duck and cover, no matter how open you are, assuming you want to preserve the the physical body, right? So in the same way, you can have this posture of openness as your default, but at a certain moment, you feel, maybe now's the time to put on the armor of the goddess. Maybe now's the time to bring some of my allies around, some of my protector spirits, to walk with me so I can continue to feel open because I have them alongside my posse, as it were. So it's actually, I can stay open because I feel the power of that protection. I don't need to shut down and become small at any point energetically.
Yeah, beautiful. And for those who don't know, yeah, any of the specific practices, or even just to hear your take on some of those installation practices, I think would be really interesting, because I'm going to get into some of it. And also any, recommendations on text that specifically talk about the like installation of the deities or the mantras in various parts of the body in order to protect it.
Yeah, well, nyasa, mantra nyasa, the main goal of mantra nyasa, installing mantric syllables in the body, is not protection. It can serve for that, but it's the main purpose is empowerment, is to realize, oh, this body is a microcosm of the whole universe. All the gods are within me. And to realize that more non-conceptually through the installation of the mantric energies throughout the body on up to 50 different points of the body. But there are protection rites that are much simpler. For example, again, if your practice is actually working and you're generating power, then your practice space tends to attract those non-corporeal beings, most of which are relatively innocent, but you want to clear the space every morning. And traditionally in Tantra, you take a flower and you place the flower in your hand in a particular mudra, and then you whisper your weapon mantra, your protective mantra, into the flower. You imagine the flower bursting into flames, into energetic flames with the power of the mantra, and then you fling the flower into the practice space, and it functions like an energetic grenade and clears the space. And you get out of the way to let everything come out, and then you enter your practice space. So the whole thing is very quick, really. I've told people in North American winter that don't have flowers that they can use a pine cone in the winter. In India, you always have flowers, so they never thought of an alternative thing. But that's one example of a simple space clearing ritual. And then protecting the perimeter of your space, not just your practice space, but for example, if I were going to a cabin in the woods, me and some friends are going to a cabin in the woods. It's not our place. We've never been there. It's a Airbnb or whatever. That would be the kind of situation where I would want to put protection around the perimeter, because God knows what's going on there. Clear the space, put the protection that I don't necessarily need to put in my own home on a daily basis, but I will in my own home if I'm going to do some powerful practice. Then the guardians of the directions are invoked. So, for example, in classical Tantra, and I mean both Shaiva and Buddhist and other forms, it's pretty much the same. So you invoke the power of the storm in the east, Indra by name, with his mantra, the power of fire in the southeast, Agni, the power of death in the south, but you're invoking death as a protector, just to be clear. It's not that you're calling in death, you're asking death to be your protector, which is very powerful. He protects the southern direction in Tantra. In the southwest, we invoke the power of chaos as protector, Niriti. In the west, the power of the ocean, Varuna. In the northwest, the power of the wind, Vayu. In the north, the power of the mountains, the mountain spirits, Kubera. Kubera is often thought of as a god of wealth, but he's also lord of spirits, yakshas, mountain spirits in this case. In the northeast, we invoke Shiva, a particular form of Shiva, who's a protector, Ishana. And above, the power of creation or procreation, Brahma, and below, in the earth, the power of stability, Vishnu. So each of these deities, Lokapalas, they're called, protector deities, they have a mantra, and you position them, and you remember what elemental powers they're associated with, so it's not just their name. And if you want to then double down on extra power and protection, you give each deity their weapon, right? So their weapon is like their special implement. So Indra has a thunderbolt, Agni has a spear, Death, Yama, has a staff, and so on. And then there's mantras for their implements too, if you want that extra circle of protection. But the whole point is that when you're doing this kind of practice as a tantrika, it's very different from how I've seen Christians pray. The Christians pray in fear, like, "Oh Lord, please don't let us be destroyed." And a tantrika invokes protector deities in confidence. And that attitude of confidence is thought to matter, that you trust your protectors and you invoke them with confidence, not fearfully. And that makes a big difference to the circle of protection. So these are just a couple of examples of protective rites. Lastly, I'd mention that we seal the sense gates often just in a very simple way, like at the end of a practice, by imagining a flash of light, a flash of blue light, I was taught, but it could be white light, flash of light at each of the orifices of the body, the gates of the body, and the mantra whom. So, and it just takes a few seconds. So, and the crown of the head is also considered an orifice, um, even though you have a skull there, right? But when you're a tiny baby, you didn't, right? And that door never fully closes, you know. So we protect all these orifices with whom and a flash of blue light, the lower orifices as well, and just as a way of like consecrating the body again, not from a fearful stance. um, so those are some of the rites, and you know, a tantrika traditionally would know all of these inside and out, bring them into play when needed. There's just all these tools for interacting with and negotiating with the animate world that help the person feel empowered and equipped in an unpredictable world, instead of sort of at the mercy of unpredictability, which I think many people feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying about the confidence in it, and this is something I've seen in other animate traditions as well. It's like the invocation of the guardianship is the guardianship, and you don't have to worry. It's like it's not coming from a place of cowering before, yeah, like scary forces. It's coming from a place of understanding that there's a way to establish oneself and boundary and mandala, you could call it in a way. And I think that's really important. There's like a side spiral we could go down, which I don't think we should. Just really interested in the historicity of how the Vedic deities end up becoming the mandala of guardian deities in the tantric world. And Tim Alsina talked about that a little bit too when I spoke with him, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
fascinating. But
Well, briefly,
go ahead.
the evolution of the mandala, the Mandalic vision, right, is very much where each new revelation, each new more powerful deity erupts into the center and pushes the circuits out further. So obviously the Vedic deities are on the furthest out circuit, and they become the guardians because they're subordinate to the circuits of deities and powers that are more interior to the mandala. um, and there's more to it than that, of course, historically, but that's kind of what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's so brilliant. And the whole way that the mandala comes to encapsulate like the actual physical architecture of the temple and ritual structures, and then the architecture of the consciousness of the individual. But then also, like in the case of the Kubjika mandala, like the socio-cultural classes and influence and architecture of the society as well. And it's a um, profound, as you know very well. It's just a profound and incredible vision.
Yeah, and it's
Um,
also about bringing order to apparent chaos, or if we want to speak even more non-dual, it's about discerning the implicit order and making it more explicit and more structured and powerful, so that so that all the lines of energy and force are open and available, as opposed to seemingly intersecting randomly. You know.
yeah, absolutely. And within that, the raw potentiality of the individual consciousness, which is ultimately the great consciousness. But that potentiality, through tantric practice, gets shaped or realizes its pre-existing shape. But sometimes I think there's a tendency to think that that's not work in the modern world. There's a tendency to think that that's not work that needs to be done. That you know consciousness in its existing state is inherently perfect, so I don't actually have to do a lot of shaping and working with the architecture of my consciousness, when in fact it takes practice and repetition to allow the consciousness to find, you could say, like an adherence to its primordial shape.
In fact, that was beautifully said. And I would add, look, consciousness is inherently perfect, infinitely harmonious on the grandest scale. And you don't need to do any work as long as you're okay getting devoured by a bear on your next camping trip, right? Because that is part of the perfection of consciousness. But assuming that you don't want to get devoured by a bear, maybe also you don't want to get devoured by something else that's less apparent. And so again, it's this that we need to address that misunderstanding of non-duality that creeps in so easily. And the reminder is, what does Kali look like? She's a goddess and she's utterly terrifying, right? Until you realize her as the divine mother. And Shiva dances in cremation grounds. So, in other words, the play of consciousness delights in death and destruction as much as it delights in birth and growth. So, if you're not 100% on board with that yet, you need to negotiate the parameters of your embodied experience. And that matters. And it's almost like these, you know what, the folks who are doing like Advaita Vedanta and this whitewashed version of Kashmir Shaivism, they are privileged. And the people who created the tradition in the first place, they lived in a very different world and they negotiated all the time with other humans, non-corporeal beings, everything. And they felt the delicate balance of life so viscerally. Just as a little example, Abhinavagupta is talking about, at one point, he's talking about sympathetic sensation. He says, sympathetic sensation, like when you see someone get stabbed in the stomach with a spear and your own stomach contracts sympathetically when you see them stabbed in the stomach. And he just says this like, yeah, we've all seen that. Come
Yeah,
on.
we've all seen someone get stabbed in the stomach with a spear. Right?
Right, but that's the thing. It's like if you're in that world, not the privileged world that most people doing non-duality are in, then you could never make these mistakes, these spiritual bypassy sort of mistakes about it.
Yeah, the framework in which they sat was very different, and this is something that I talk about all the time, and it's beautiful to hear your perspective on it because yeah, if you're in a completely privileged detached space and you're practicing, then it's easy to jump right to the absolute monism of everything. But when you're actually negotiating a world of poisonous plants and crocodiles that want to eat you and people who might stab you in the stomach with a spear, then it really helps to have practices, of safeguarding. And that gets to, there's a couple different routes, but I'm also conscious of time. And so maybe I'll take it right to kind of the big question. And so you mentioned the word malevolence earlier, possibly because I might have mentioned it. And I think that, you know, I've seen varying understandings within varying traditions around, like, you could say, the inherent malevolence or non-malevolence of beings. And oftentimes beings are simply just hungry, like you're saying. Like, oftentimes it's not Catholicized, like, there are either good spirits or there are bad spirits, right? Like, often it's like, oh, that's a wilderness being and it has its priorities and its purviews and its realm. And if if I tread in its realm, then there may be consequences, and that doesn't mean that that being is bad. It just means that that being has other priorities. And then I've also seen, like, even in like the Tibetan tantras, which is where I started my tantric journey, was in Tibetan Buddhist practice. There's a lot of talk of like evil spirits, right? Um, and so I'm interested in, you know, in the big question, like in the Near Enemies book, you have a whole chapter on how there's not really such a thing as negative energy. Um, I'm interested in your perception of the non-dual tantric vision of, is there such a thing as evil malevolence, or is it simply a matter of different priorities? And certainly you could say, I mean, and this is how I tend to view it, like certainly you can say that there is such a thing as like discord, and discord, vibrational discord. Like when you even look at like the structure of music, like there is mathematically such a thing as vibrational discord, right? Um, like, is it gradations of discordance, or how do you see it? How do you see this big topic of,
Yeah.
are there evil spirits, or is it simply gradations of discord?
It's a good question. There are, I don't even know if discord is the right word, because yes, discord, relatively speaking, but we have to remember that an entity that is aggressive and malevolent from our point of view might just be perfectly normal from its own point of view, and just doing its normal, natural thing, like we walk down the street. And so, as my friend Ben Jaffe says, these entities often don't know how they appear to us, which is why if they're going to appear, we can sometimes invite them to appear in a different guise, but sometimes not, right? So it's if listeners have never experienced this, then they are just going to think this is just overactive imagination, right? You have a vision and you think it's an entity, but no, we're talking about experiences where the presence of another force, another being, is as palpable as somebody coming up and standing right behind you and then tapping you on the shoulder. It actually can be more palpable than that, more obvious, more impressive. So it's but again, for most people this is a rare sort of experience, or they don't have it at all. But what I would say is, most beings are hungry, some beings are curious, but also there are some beings that are equivalent to a psychotic human. A psychotic human might shoot you in the face because he doesn't care, and why not, and he happens to have a gun at that moment, or because it feels fun, or because it feels powerful for him, right? So thankfully such people are relatively few and far between, but there are psychopath, I actually used the wrong word, not a psychotic human, a psychopath, right, who can't feel empathy and will just hurt someone for the fun of it, right? So there are non-corporeal beings like that too, uh, but are there any that are sort of pure evil, like the Catholic tradition imagines, or the movies imagine? You know, I don't think so, but some teachers of mine and some friends of mine have spoken to me of other dimensions that are much farther removed from ours, because of course a lot of non-corporeal beings are right here all around us, but sort of folded into a slightly different dimension, like the theory of 11 dimensions in string theory. They're right here, the dimensions are curled up right here, but there's also dimensions that are much harder to access, because they're not right here, but there's a possibility of some sort of contact sometimes. And so these people speak of dimensions where there is something that from our perspective feels like pure evil. And I don't know, I've sort of almost sensed the possibility of that in my own experience, but not really, so I don't know. And I hope that they're imagining things, but it's possible that they're not, that there's range of dimensional realities that most people will never know about. And that's going to include, of course, dimensions of beings who, from our perspective, we would say they're pure love, they're pure care, they're pure compassion. So in the tantric vision, everything is balanced, everything is perfectly balanced. And if the world seems to be a terrible place full of suffering, it's only because the news reports almost exclusively on suffering and not on the countless millions and millions of moments of joy that happen every day all over the world. And if only you could sense all of it, you would sense how exquisitely balanced it is. Not necessarily all at the same time, right? Because the balance stretches over time and space. But there's balance in everything from a big enough scale. So yeah, I mean, in my experience and that of most of my teachers and most of my peers, the range of non-corporeal beings, they range along two axes. One is like super helpful and they can be allies, to neutral, the majority of the bell curve, to just cruel, nasty things that want to fuck with you if you come across their path, and otherwise they're not, because they don't care about you per se. But then the other axis is distinctness, where some of these non-corporeal beings are not entities. They're not as distinct as us humans or our cats and dogs and animals. They're more smeared out over the whatever the equivalent of the electromagnetic spectrum is for for prana. So you can, like when you, out of the corner of your eye, you'll just see these blobs of energy scooting along the edge of the floor, in the corner or whatever. And they're like rats. They're like energetic equivalent of rats. and they don't have much definition, and they don't have much power, all the way up to things that can have a lot of, at least temporary, a lot of definition and power, and can appear in any sort of way. And of course, in the tantric tradition, you need to realize the nature of non-duality in a very deep way in order to be able to handle anything, right? Because if you were confronted with the most powerful entity, it could happen in your dream too. It could, or it could happen in the waking state or in the liminal state, right? But if you're confronted by the most powerful and threatening entity, if you can authentically realize that it's nothing but your own consciousness in another form, it disempowers that entity, and it loses interest, right? And the thing is that Westerners cannot understand the difference between it's just a figment of my mind and it's just a form of my own consciousness, because there's a difference, right? It's not that you're imagining it and it has no independent power. It's that everything is a form of your own consciousness, and the realization of that changes your relationship to other entities in a profound way. So there's these stories. I mentioned my friend Ben Jaffe, who used to live in Boulder when I was there, and he has collected a number of these fascinating accounts of how the tantric adept, the master practitioner, is able to deal with even the most dramatic entities, because these powerful practitioners, they emanate such energy that powerful entities are drawn to them, and they need to be able to recognize the objectless play of consciousness as themselves and the other, and realize, no, I'm not going to be in your drama. The entity is in a sense real, or at least as real as anything else is in the dream. But when you don't become a victim, it can't be a perpetrator. But that has to be visceral. It's not just a thing you're doing with your mind, right? It's deep in the
Yeah.
body. Realize that, and so you might want to interview him. He's got
It's
great stories about that.
so I think yeah, I mean, to wrap it up, and then we can shift perspectives if you want. But to wrap it up, like earlier you said, it's important not to get too hung up on this stuff. And I think that that's important because I've seen it go, and I'm going to use examples from like the plant medicine traditions here. I've seen, you know, Westerners encounter very intricate Amazonian plant medicine traditions that have a lot of understandings of like psychic darts and malevolent energies, and those understandings are so baked into the culture that it works for that culture. But then Westerners encounter it, and all of a sudden, and they encounter it in heightened states of perception, and all of a sudden they're seeing malevolent spirits everywhere, and they get paranoid. And that is the flip side of this, right? Which is it can lead to a kind of paranoia. And then in the plant medicine space, you have the opposite of that too, which is, you could say, and this is where I see a lot of this, being necessary, because people in these extremely heightened and amplified states of consciousness are porous and are susceptible. And you have the phenomena of people taking plant medicine all the time in circles of people that they have no idea who those people are, and like people with dubious shamanic credentials and this type of thing. And yeah, so my interest is my interest is in that balance between not going down the road of paranoia, but recognizing that, particularly in amplified states of consciousness, and rituals that are inviting deep trance states and this type of thing, whether it's plant medicine or not, that some type of guardianship container boundary is helpful and necessary.
Yeah, I've seen examples of people who've gotten possessed in plant medicine ceremonies, and one possible possession is possession by a fear demon, which would bring this paranoia on that's very hard to shake. And again, the term demon, it's like these terms are thrown around in India, Tibet, and so on, but it doesn't need to be taken too literally, right? Because it's not anything like the Western tradition of, like, demons are, they have specific names like Beelzebub or or whoever else, and these are just more like forms of energy that can have some persistence, that have vectors. They move intentionally even if they're not a person, right? um and so, like, a fear demon would be an example of that. So guardianship, and the thing is, you can't just do it at the snap of a finger. Like, if you were taking this group of people and they wanted to have a plant medicine ceremony, okay, great, but first you need a week of bonding and getting to know each other and getting to feel safe, and at least, like, what's going on with so-called plant medicines. It's crazy because there is none of that proper preparation, and it's because of the business. Let's not kid ourselves. It's a business, and it's a profitable business. So yeah, like, I was giving examples of practices, then listeners might hear and say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put those deities there. I'm going to find out what those mantras are. Yes, if you are an experienced, empowered practitioner who, when you invoke something, that is not an empty thing, that's a real speech act that has an effect, then yes. And if not, you need to build a container with human connection also. You need to, this group of people, show each other you care, you build trust and this sort of thing, and you create the container energetically. through human connection and care and compassion before you suddenly raise the stakes, and heighten the environment with something like a psychotropic or a psychedelic. Um, from the tantric point of view, it's funny that people like the term plant medicine, because everything that's a medicine can also be a poison. And so you should call it by its right name. That it's well, we don't have a word for that in English, but medicine or poison, depending on the person, depending on the context. That would remind everyone of the reality of what they're getting involved with. And the plant has a spirit of its own. And if it's a concoction, it's a brew, there's maybe more than one spirit getting involved. And people have this weird view that comes from Western psychology that whatever you experience on the trip, whether it's ayahuasca or mushrooms or whatever else, it's just what's inside you coming out and being shown to you. And from a tantric point of view, we would say, no, 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 you're communing with a spirit. So the experience you're having is co-created with the spirit. And it's not just what's inside you, it's also what's in the spirit. And so, like, people, like, if they just have a better sense of what they're getting into, that could make all the difference. But the lack of education, it's kind of shocking. And what to do, that's the economics of the world that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, what I feel empowered to do is simply do an episode on guardianship and talk about it, because I see so much what I would call kind of unguarded shenanigans going on. So just offering a simple perspective on, hey, every animate tradition I've ever encountered, there's some type of guardianship, talked about. And so it's going to go through, this is very helpful and very interesting conversation, and this will be featured prominently for sure.
Now, the question of, are these things real? Like, that's what people want to know. Like, are ghosts real? Are spirits real? Are these non-corporeal beings that you speak of real? Or are they just archetypes? And, like, again, from the non-dual tantric point of view, it's sort of the wrong question, because the only thing that's real is experience.
Mm,
If it's meaning to say consciousness is everything and everything is consciousness, and consciousness is another way of saying experience. So if only experience is real, right, and experience includes our imagination of a world outside experience that we never actually contact, that we never see or hear or taste or touch, right? So we say there's only experience, and all experience is real. So there's no, when somebody asks the question, but are these beings real? They're imagining a static objective world separate from and prior to consciousness. And do those beings exist in that world? And we say there is no such world.
yeah.
So if people experience these beings, they're real insofar as they're experienced, because literally the only thing that's real is experience. And if people exercised guardianship also over their own experience, knowing, oh, I have a more unstable mind, or I'm the sort of person who goes to pieces easily, or it's like knowing that you're the sort of person that if you take a powerful psychedelic, you might have a breakdown. And so maybe I'm not going to do that,
Mm,
But so also creating guardrails for experience that are not paranoid and not fearful, but just getting the container you need. It's like you need, just like to have meaningful human connection, you need to feel safe. If you're on guard, you can't have the meaningful connection. So the
mm.
same applies in the spiritual life as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. It's difficult for Western minds to get beyond the want for a flat, objectively independently existing reality. But
Yeah.
you can't get past that triangle of cognizer, cognized, and active cognition. There's no
Yeah.
there's no separating it out.
And of course, that triangle, I mean, that experientially can collapse to a single point, a
Right.
bindu point, but it's still only experience.
Mm.
Look, so we don't have that much time, but what if I just ask you a couple questions, and then it's
Sure.
like a
Yeah.
teaser for another time when I interview you more fully?
Totally. Yeah. That's fine.
Okay, the number one question, maybe the only one we'll have time for. Um, as you're one of the leading voices in the renaissance of animacy, and you have a lot of experience with tantric traditions, both Hindu and Buddhist. And do you see animacy and tantric traditions as hugely overlapping? Do you see some distinction that's worthy of note? And most importantly, what have been the most meaningful insights and experiences that Tantra has given you, that are also applicable to your experience of the world from the perspective of animacy?
Mm. Well, what a profoundly beautiful question to talk about. It's one of my favorite topics. And yeah, I, you know, have been deeply immersed in both, you could say. And I think at the beginning it's worth noting that animism is a modern word for what is ultimately, you could say, kind of a default mode of interacting with the cosmos. And within that, then you get the kind of gradations of tradition and how they see the actual navigation of the human being in this world of living forces. And not all of those traditions are the same, and we certainly live in an era where pointing out differences is extremely important. In the time of Joseph Campbell, it was like time for us to see commonalities, and
Yeah.
now it's kind of time for us to see differences. And but I actually think that understanding commonalities in these types of experiences remains incredibly important, because it gives us clues into the nature of ourselves and the nature of reality. So, to answer the first part of your question, I see tremendous overlap, and it's one of my kind of heart, I would say, subversive missions with the podcast, because I don't talk about it all the time. But you hear me talk about Tantra quite a bit, and I talk about Tantra quite a bit because it's a framework that has shaped a lot of my worldview, and because I see within it the deep, deep, deep animacy, and I think that animacy can get lost, kind of per our conversation today. That animacy can get lost if we kind of give in to the Western tendency to view everything as conceptual. And, a lot of these traditions, some of the first images of, tantric deities came to us through Carl Jung. And, well, I believe that Carl Jung himself kind of understood the reality of the animacy of the forces he was talking about. There's been a tendency to view the tantric in terms of the psychological or conceptual. And those deities, like you're just talking about, those deities and forces, and the like the boar-headed yogini and this kind of thing, as those are just quote unquote projections of consciousness. Those are just your imagination, and the just is the part that I'd like to extract. It's like, yes, they are projections of the great consciousness in the tantric vision, but that doesn't negate their reality, their agency, their ability to and want to interact with you in your in your field of action. Um, so that little just is key there, because if you dive deeper into tantric practice and look at the rituals and those Tibetan rituals in which they're naming force after force after force after local spirit after local spirit after local spirit. They're not just doing that to like get to the good stuff later. You know, those aren't the kind of extraneous cultural parts that really don't matter, and what really matters is the ritual at the center. Those parts are actually deeply inherent to the overarching vision and the overarching worldview, which, as we were talking about earlier, is a mandalic vision, right? The divine is a mandala, and Tim Alsina talked about this really beautifully when I was talking with him yesterday. Like, yes, there's the point at the center, and the point at the center is extremely important. And then all of the ways that it unfolds and all of the beings in that mandala, those are real too, and that's important too, and that's all the, you know, that's all the deity as well. So I think that, you know, part of what I'm trying to get at in talking about Tantra in relation to animism is like, let's lift up the veil a little bit and look, you know, with a little more clarity, like, oh, this is clearly an animate tradition. It's, you know, it's clearly, you know, go through any Tibetan Buddhist, you know, um, and Hindu tantric, you know, go through any the stages of any ritual, and you are seeing, you know, um, a vision of a living world with that is populated by yakshas and you know, forces and this type of thing. So I think there's that aspect of it, and within that, I see Tantra as this incredible marriage of visions of the ultimate and visions of the local, and the ultimate um, indistinction between the ultimate and the local, as far as every aspect of the mandala is sacred, every corner of the mandala counts, and every aspect of the mandala is utilized in one way or another for our particular journey. You know, and then you get in, like you were mentioning a conversation with Ben Jaffe, and like then you get into like, you know, the Tibetan mountain animism, and you could say like the influence of shamanic traditions on tantric tradition and this type of thing. And you, it's it's just profoundly undeniable. I mean, you have Dzogchen traditions, like you have Dzogchen practices where people are like literally howling like wolves in order to take themselves into states of samadhi, and you know, the deity practices in which one assumes the body of Vajrayogini and this type of thing. It's like this bears a real resemblance to ancient shapeshifting practices, and I think this type of interplay and interchange, um, you know, I think it's kind of a what you could say colonial impulse to want to negate what can be called like the folk elements of tantric tradition, and that has to be resisted. We have to be able to look at like this full gamut of practices and understand, you know, understand that, oh, this, all of this is what tantra is. Tantra is not just quote unquote those grand visions of Shiva Shakti consciousness. Tantra is also, you know, the mantra for the weapon, and the mantra, like the engagement with all of the local forces and the local vibrational configurations. So, um, so in that way, it's like a huge joy for me to explore this stuff and to kind of, you know, try to rekindle the animacy in my own small way that exists within Tantra. And then, like, are there differences between tantric tradition and certain animate traditions? Of course, yeah. And there are animate traditions that I would say are very what I would call lateral, that are mostly about navigating. You could call them like terrestrial forces, and aren't so much about how those terrestrial forces funnel us towards an experience of the ultimate. Um, and then there are also animate traditions that talk about the ultimate all the time and talk about all of the local nature beings as expressions of that ultimacy. And, you know, Nud Rasmussen, way back when, had an interview with a Inuit shaman in the 19th century. And, he's talking about basically the great overarching spirit consciousness that infuses everything, and then how it manifests as all these local spirit beings and this type of thing. And you could be listening to someone talking about Tantra. It's like that, congruent.
Yeah. Let me just add one thing, because you're not only right about Tantra, you might be more right than you realize, because the scholarly picture we've gotten of Tantra, and the translations that came out in the wake of the colonial period, they are distortive. And what a lot of people, I guess, don't realize is that, in the average village or town, the tantrika was the guy that you would call to help you negotiate with the local spirits. Like, that was the main function for many people, of like, why would you even talk to this person? Because they know how to talk to the nagas and the naganis, like the serpent spirits around the perimeter of the village. And if they're not happy, nothing's going to go right. This kind of thing. But even if we scale up to the great tantric masters, like Abhinavagupta, like people imagine he was, something like a magisterial saintly figure. Without a doubt, in his daily life, he was doing all the things. He was doing all the shamanic things and the protective things, and he was moved, like he was an awakened being and a liberated being, right? So he was moving in this world fluidly, with not a sense of separate self. Just, this is the dynamic play of forces and energies, and he's engaged in it. But even such a high level tantrika was never removed from this world. So it's like people have gotten such a distorted and westernized picture. So I would say, yeah, Tantra was even more uh, animate, and even more along the lines of where you instinctively move than even you might have realized, and that's a really cool thing.
Well, and part of what it comes from in me is a whole lot of time traveling around rural India and seeing and being invited to, rituals that maybe weren't ostensibly tantric, but rituals sometimes that were taking place at tantric sites and in village sites and this type of thing, that are so clearly navigating the realm of spirit possession and animism, and seeing who the goddess is, and then seeing how those local goddesses find their way into like the tantric mandalas and this type of thing, and like understanding that there's like a like what you're talking about, there's a substrate here that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and that substrate is what you could call animism. Right, that substrate, and I love the vision of Abhinavagupta out there, like, doing the work of interacting with the local spirits and this kind of thing. And I think, for me, his genius, I mean, it comes on many, 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 many levels, but one of the levels it comes on is seeing like the sound is the deity, and the like his ability to recognize the animate forces in the local and put them in their kind of high exalted place, while still talking about some of the most like grand visions of universal consciousness, and seeing really ultimately no distinction between that spark or energetic that happens in the local ritual and that grand vision. And that, to me, like what he did, I think is just a work of absolute genius in that way, which is um, you know it is, yes, we are speaking about the ultimate nature of the cosmos, and we are speaking about also the things that are the most immediate and tangible and navigable and in front of us all the time. And it is, and it's one of the reasons I've loved like the Kubjika text and like Mark's translation of the Kumarika Kandaha, that that goes into this again in like the Kubjika mandala, which incorporates all of the elements of society, the varying like professions and everything like that, incorporated into the Kubjika mandala, like basically saying that, yeah, this is all an expression of this divine play of Shiva Shakti consciousness. And then at the same time, um, you know, it is a world of local forces, and we are in navigation with those local forces, and that unfolds along this kind of mandala structure too. So yeah, I see that beauty in there, and I think that recognizing differences is important. Not every animate tradition sees it all to be an expression of one great consciousness, and those traditions, like, you have to look in each environment as to what's like navigable, I guess. But yeah, to bring it full circle, like, really what has stood out for me in years and years and years of traveling in India is the substrate, and that substrate is undoubtedly, decidedly animist. And even you go to Buddhist texts, and the Buddha, like the old Buddhist text, not even the tantric texts, the Buddha is probably encouraging us to not get too hung up on yakshas and things like this. But then it's also established in those texts, like, oh yeah, and the Buddha gave this sermon, and this sermon was in the place that was ruled by this yaksha, and there were all these other yakshas around. And it's like, it's the substrate, and that substrate, like, again, isn't just local cultural flavor. And that's where the kind of I think colonial aspect comes in the West. We assume, like, okay, the real thing that the Buddha is talking about is the meditative practice, and all this stuff about, you know, um, deities and animate beings and forces, and all of that's the extraneous stuff. And I feel like that tendency of the West to take out those animate parts is something that's really worth looking at. Why is it that we do that? Why is it that we extract what we think is, you know, the essence of the teachings, and consider all of the context, rituality, animacy to be somehow extraneous?
In fact, again, you're even more right than you know, maybe, because from a tantric point of view, it's almost the other way around from what these Westerners are assuming. Like, because of course there are tantric lineages that have as a key teaching everything is the one consciousness, the one divine consciousness, and all of that. But also from a tantric point of view, the negotiating the world of powers and forces is indispensable, whereas realization of the absolute nature of consciousness is dispensable from the point of view of our embodied being, right? As human embodied beings, like if at the moment of death, then that's when it might be indispensable, right? But if it's like if you were going to lose one thing, you would lose the vision of the absolute and stay with the ability to negotiate with forces, because that's everything. It's everything in our embodied existence, you know. And
Yeah.
so only some tantric teachers are saying, because they realized, oh, this is all a play of one fundamental consciousness. But that was not as central to the tantric tradition as forces and powers and energies and their manipulation, which is like a dirty word in English, but manipulation in a good sense, learning to work with the forces and powers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, that's awesome the way you put that. And like that, you know, you don't jump to the center of the mandala simply by thinking your way there. Like, yeah, like you don't jump to the state of absolute union of Shiva Shakti, even though ultimately you're already there, right? But you don't jump there simply by thinking your way there. You navigate your way through the mandala structure to get there. And that mandala structure. And to me, that's where it feels like it's about honoring Shakti in a way. It's about, like, maybe the Western tendency to minimize or skip over Shakti. And Shakti, like, is the actual world of forces, right? So navigating Shakti, understanding her patterns, her tendencies, who lives where, and what their relationalities are, like, that's the beauty of it. The beauty of a Shakti tradition, is in, like, not just in our ability to have those moments where we feel, the ultimate, which are phenomenal and wonderful, but in how we navigate Shakti herself and her actual manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can be experienced with no separation, right? Or the absolute in and as the manifestation. But that's yeah. If you are experiencing separation, you better pay attention to manifestation. um,
Exactly. Totally.
yeah. And what if you would say just briefly, like, what is an example of a key insight? I mean, you've already talked about the Mandalic vision of of reality, and but in terms of your direct experience doing tantric practice, what did it give you, or how does it undergird your life experience or your spiritual practice?
I think that that's at the heart of all of this. And it's because, I encountered Tantra very young, and I started seriously practicing Tibetan Tantra when I was 14. And there's just simply, I feel a difference in encountering something in that kind of precarious open phase of adolescence and development than there is kind of being a fully formed Westerner and then encountering it, more conceptually later on. And I'm sure you know about this too, because I know you grew up in Eastern tradition. It's like, it's different when you grow up in it. And so for me, I think I can see that Tantra informed every single aspect of my worldview and how I navigate reality. Um, you know, Starting to do um, tantric deity mandala practices and what are sometimes called visualization practices, though I never thought that really does justice to them, because it's not just like picturing something, it's
Mm.
actually architecting something. Just like manipulation doesn't do justice to it, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, you know, I started doing those at a very young age, and in doing those at a very young age, like feeling um, like, when you're a kid encountering all these animate forces, you're much less likely to skip over them as like the extraneous stuff, and you're much more likely to be like, ooh, who is the king from the copper colored mountain, and who, like, you're much more likely to want to understand them in their definitive and tangible quality. And you know and so practicing from that perspective, I think, embedded in me um and a simultaneously like cosmologically tantric worldview, but also like a deep felt experience of these forces being real, being tangible and real. And then, travel experience, and very well, when you get in, like when you were saying earlier, kind of, you know hey, dear listeners, just so you know, like, you're talking about something entering the room that is as tangible as somebody, like, standing behind you. Like a lot of people don't know that, and they haven't had that experience. And I had gradations of that experience. And then I finally had one experience, which I talked about in the goddess episode, which was so completely, totally, utterly undeniable. And particularly because it wasn't an experience I was looking for. I was not there on purpose, and I wasn't there to, like, study possession rituals or anything like this. I was just invited there last minute. And what came into the room was of such potency and force that my head was pushed down, and like pushed down hard, and I could not lift my head to save my life. It was that tangible, that strong.
Was it pushed all the way down to the earth,
It
or
was like,
just
yeah, mostly
yeah?
mostly all the way. Yeah, mostly all the way. And for other people, other people were going into full states of convulsion, and jerking around on the floor, and like speaking in tongues, and this type of thing. Um, and you know, a luminosity was emanating from uh, something that should not be, by all scientific rational definition, emanating luminosity. And it was simply undeniable. It was
Yeah.
just like, oh, if I ever
Yeah.
needed absolute final, like I had grown up feeling that these forces were real. And this experience was just like, if I ever needed absolute final, like confirmation that what we're talking about is the navigation of like actual Shakti, like actual real forces, like Kundalini isn't an imaginal, like it's imaginal in the best sense of the word, but it's not imaginal in terms of the mind just making it up,
Yeah.
like if I ever needed any evidence,
Yeah.
like this was all the evidence I needed.
Was this, I remember you said something like this was a little goddess temple on the edge of a village in rural India, right?
Mm. Yeah,
What state was it in?
it was in Karnataka,
Was,
and it was
oh yeah.
probably about an hour outside of Mysore, and I was there studying Ashtanga yoga asana, and um, during the days, which you finish your Ashtanga yoga practice by 6 a.m. or so, 6:30 a.m. because you've been doing it since 4:30. During the days, I would take a motorcycle and just go out into the farming country and visit villages because I loved these little village goddess shrines. They were just like something incredibly beautiful, um, and and yeah, I found this one village, and these kids came up to me, and I tell the story in the goddess episode. But this schoolgirl came up to me and literally said, "Do you want to meet the goddess?" And I said, "Yes," because I've also know
Hell yeah.
it's not an invitation you turn down. And in India, I'm sure you felt this too. There are invitations that come that if we're paying close, it's the same vision that allows you to see that little blob scurrying in the corner. Like there are invitations that come, energetic invitations that, if you pay attention, lead to places. And I said yes, and and I always say like this wasn't like some ooh I got invited into the secret dark, like this is their normal this is their normal way
Yeah.
of interacting and communing with the goddess, and possession in this context is seen as incredibly positive, and that's also worth noting for people who are listening. It's not like possession always equals being taken over by something you don't want. It's also a primary way in which
Yeah.
village and rural India navigates this world of forces, is positive possession. And so yeah, it was just their normal Friday morning ritual. They did it on Fridays, and I went back a couple of times too. And
Was
they had
this one of these little temples where like the goddess, the image of the goddess or the where the goddess is installed is sometimes just a rock with anointed with a little dress on it or something like, or did they have a full murti? How
no,
villagey was it?
there was no murti. It was a mound of dirt. It was like a and that adds to the whole experience of like there is no way that this thing should be like beaming luminosity out of it, right? This is literally a mound of mud.
Yeah.
Like it may have been uh you know there was a little bit of a veil around it, and the facilitator would go behind that veil and like go into the trance and then kind of distribute it out to everybody. But so it may have been, sometime you see these big ant or termite mounds that become goddess shrines, or snake holes that become goddess shrines. But
Yep.
it was a mound of earth covered in red powder, and that was it. There was no Murti, no image whatsoever. And you know, basically the facilitator went back there, and it took about 2 minutes to open the space through the introductory invocations, and then um, he hit the ground with his palm, like really forcefully hit the ground with his palm, and yeah, like made a sound. And at that moment, the entire room was just blasted open. I mean, just completely blasted open. And like I said, this wasn't something I was looking for. I mean, yeah, I was visiting, shrines and documenting. I have like an ongoing project of documenting these little village goddess shrines. I have thousands of photographs of little village goddess shrines in India, because I just find them so aesthetically beautiful. And but I wasn't looking, I hadn't experienced anything like that, and I wasn't looking for it. And the presence that entered the room was, you know, but you would have to take someone in there with incredibly thick skin to have them
Yeah.
not feel to have them not feel something in that moment. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As they say in Hindi, Judd. If you're too Judd, you're just too dense, right? But you would have to be very dense because that's real India. That's it's unfortunately slowly dying out, but that's it. It's like people think Westerners think, oh, these people are like idolaters and they worship statues. They don't realize like the statue is no more the deity than a mound of mud is or than a termite hill is. It's just like the energy wants to localize there, and then people support its localization through ritual, and it takes root, and then you feel it, and you can walk in a temple with a big beautiful murti and you feel nothing
Mm.
because it's artificial and nobody's like actually bringing the power. Or to put it from the point of view of the goddess, she doesn't want to be there. Some rich
Yeah.
person can build a temple and she doesn't want to live there. And the
Yeah.
difference
Absolutely.
is, yeah, it's so this,
Yeah.
I
And
think.
that,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, and what you're saying about the localization, like that becomes the center point of the mandala. Like the mandala can be created because, in an infinite universe, center is everywhere. And what is required of us is to make of a place a center. And when we make of that place a center and build the mandala structure of practice around it, then she starts to pour through. And it's beautiful in that, like in those local shrines, they call her Ma. I mean, she'll have her local name, and then they'll also call her Ma. And when they're calling her Ma, they're calling her the infinite, the ultimate. They're saying
Huh.
that, yes, this is a local point. This is with all of its local considerations and all of its local mandala of forces. And this is a portal to infinite Ma. This is a portal to the vastness of the universe. And that, like, confluence of the intimate, immediate, animate geography with the ultimate is, like, it's so profound and so beautiful. And it's often, I think, what is missing in Western adoptions of it. And I think in whatever way we can to start to return to that local navigation of the ultimate is to me, it's called for in the modern world. Yeah.
You absolutely nailed it so perfectly. And I rarely talk to somebody who understands the soul of India so well,
Mm.
because you just perfectly nailed it. That is the key to the entire spiritual and religious culture. Just the exact fact that you can start with a funny shaped termite hill that people feel so something odd about it, and the energy intensifies as they bring their curiosity and devotion, and then they feel it intensify and it becomes like a positive feedback loop. And before you know it, they're realizing, oh, this is a form that the goddess has taken and wants to take, and then we're going to consecrate it and create a container for it. And just as you said, this local goddess, right, becomes an access point to the universal mother. And
Mm.
there is no, it's not even two truths, like the whole two truths idea, absolute and relative. No, because there's no boundary. There's a pure seamless continuity of one opening into the other. And
Yeah.
it's so beautiful that you got to experience that.
I mean, it honestly brings tears to my eyes to even talk about it because it's so beautiful. And it's like I want for people to experience that type of beauty. And like you said, it is dying out in certain ways, but you turn a corner in India and you follow a not so traveled road. And in the rural areas, it's still very much alive and well. And then, once I had that experience, I started looking for it actively. And then when you look for it actively, like, you can find, it's sometimes we don't know the questions to ask. But then when you go and you start out, where's your, you go to a village, you're just like, yeah, show me your local snake goddess, or, can I pay my respects
Mm-hmm.
to Ma? And they'll be like, oh, you want to see Ma? Like, because it's almost, I mean, there are many possessing gods too. But the goddess is kind of a sure bet when it comes to this stuff. And, then the more you look and the more you stick around, like, you'd be like, oh yeah, every week we have a little puja ceremony where, she arrives and, sends people into these profoundly deep trance states and starts speaking through people. And that living animacy is very present and vital, and is so deeply intertwined with what Indian tradition is. Yeah. So I'm hoping in my own way to help to help people understand that and be able to experience it.
Well, to be continued, because I
Yeah.
want to hear more about your travels in India. I know you've also had great experiences at Tiruvannamalai
Mm.
and other places. It would just be great to hear a bit more of that biography and go through your journey a bit more, because this it's so rich, and people love hearing these kind of conversations too.
Mm.
So let's do it again.
Yeah, I would love to. This was actually one of the rare discussions where I was like, oh, I could use every single part of this. So, yeah, we could talk about what makes the most sense as far as releasing it and everything. But I would love to talk more too about, it would be interesting to maybe go into some specific texts too. And if you're up for that, I think that could be a really cool way of, because there are texts that I think, there are hidden animacies that it would be fun to tease out and explore a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we could have a well, one step at a time, but we could have a series potentially, and I know there's a lot of overlap in our listenership, so it could work.
Awesome, man.
Cool. Okay, this has been great. Thank you.
Yeah,
We'll be in touch.
for sure. Talk to you soon.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.